Ladies and gentlemen, welcome back to Horror Analysis with me, Drew. Oh my goodness, what a day. Today, we're still in History of Horror, and we are going back to the 30s. And after a false start yesterday, there's no way I can do 30s in one video. It's not possible. So I'm going to do 30s movies in this video, along with, the little bit of radio, which I've mentioned many times before. Basically, Lights Out began in the 30s. Hey, Lights Out began in the 30s. Actually, the first guys, of course. We'll talk about that briefly now. Then we'll go into the movies. And, of course, all the classic movies from the 30s. There's so many of them. Essentially because the talkies started in the 30s. Well, they started in the late 20s, but they got kicking in the 30s. They really kicked into high gear on the 30s. I have a pages and pages of like 36 pictures of basically just movie posters from the 30s. Like, this movie and this movie and this movie. It's getting listy. I don't want to be listy because that doesn't tell you anything. It doesn't teach anything. It's showing you pretty pictures, which is nice. But it's not what I'm after. Literature is going to get even worse because we're getting to Lovecraft, supernatural horror, and literature. When we get into literature next video, literature of the 30s. This was written in 1927, so we're not quite there yet, but in essence we are there. Lovecraft died in the 30s, so his ending works are there. And tomorrow, Robert E. Howard died in the 30s. Clark Ashton Smith stopped writing in the 30s because his buddies Robert E. Howard and Howard Phillips Lovecraft died. Robert E. Howard blew his brains out. Committed suicide. That's the more elegant way to put it. And also the older people like Kipling died in the 30s. Who else died in the 30s? There was another big name. Anyway, and when we get into Lovecraft in this, he gets listy. I have pages of authors. This is just lists of authors that he gets. So from page 76 to 85, that's 9 pages, I have over a page of authors. That's for British tradition. And then in the same time period, there's American tradition as well, with another half page in 14 pages. And then another couple pages for modern masters, but there's only 5 authors discussed in that, which isn't a list. But some people he doesn't consider masters. Howard isn't even on the list at all. Clark Ashton Smith is part of the American tradition, but not a master in Lovecraft's eyes. And of course, Lovecraft doesn't mention himself in any of it. And we all think of Lovecraft as a master, or you should if you don't. But today we're talking about movies, and that should be enough. That'll be more than enough. Oh, and last time, I tried to do this video last night, and it was confusing. You can probably guess that I'm kind of frazzled now. Oh, I have my boiling water. Just because movies are ridiculous, there's a lot of movies that came out in the 30s that are horror movies. There's a couple of reasons for that. Before I get into the reasons for that, I think I'm going to go over radio first. Radio was also going on during this time. TV wasn't. definitely pre-TV era. Um, the first horror television show was the Boris Karloff Mystery Theater, and that started in 49. 49? I'm almost positive. I don't have my notes something. Mystery Playhouse, Boris Karloff, 49-ish, according to my notes, so that's nice and exact. Lights Out, the Arch Oboler one that Stephen King loved, and many others have loved. Bill Cosby did a sketch about it. It's Arch Oboler. And we talked about him in the 40s as well. Yeah, we did. Lights Out began in 34. And from 34 to 36, the first main writer of it was Willis Cooper. And then from 36 onward, Arch Oboler took over. From 36 to 47. And then from 46, it started on TV with other things going on. And that would be the first of the big horror on radio. Maybe I should have had this together with literature. It's difficult. I have to break up 30s into two different things. But what I want to have is for movies to be sort of separate, because movies did their own thing in the 30s, independent of other things going on. Radio may have been influenced by literature, and literature may have been influenced by radio, and there might be some like some sort of conversation going on, some cross-pollination. There's got to be a better word for what I'm after here. Which is part of the problem yesterday was I was just not getting my words right. It's starting again, folks. That's very boiling water. Very hot. There's not really any cross-pollination with movies, because movies in the 30s, they were tearing through to get as much out, because the talking picture started. Actually, the same year that this was published, the first feature-length talking picture came out, The Jazz Singer, 1927. Technology for the talking pictures goes back to 1900. I think one of the world's fairs had it as a big thing. Hey, talking pictures, wave of the future. Well, yes, they are. But it took them 30 years to get it. Almost 30 years to get it going on for a feature length, 27. And then after that, the movies will of course start pelting out, because obviously no one's going to want to watch a silent movie if they can watch a sounded movie. So the movies actually didn't have a cross-pollination there was no dialogue between movie makers influencing writers and writers influencing movie makers. Most of the movies came out in the 30s were classics. They were Dracula, Frankenstein, The Invisible Man, Dr. Jekyll and Mr. Hyde. There's some other ones thrown in there, like King Kong and The Mummy, which weren't necessarily classic stories. But there are also, Poe stuff. There's Murders in the Rue Morgue, The Raven, Hannah of the Baskervilles was done, Monkey's Paw, The Most Dangerous Game, classic horror-ish stories. She, which... Oh, I forgot. He's Marion C. Cooper. Okay. Blah, blah, blah. But most of them are, just the classics. Get the classics out because people will go and see them. Of course they will. It's the first time you see Frankenstein in a talking picture. Yeah, that's a winner. Duh. Dracula, same deal. Dr. Jekyll and Mr. Hyde, yeah. Invisible Man, which is a another Stevenson. Is it Stevenson? I'm almost positive. What do we have here? H.G. Wells. Come on, Drew. H.G. Wells. I read that one too. So, sort of horror classics. Invisible Man's not quite a very good adaptation. Well, but then again, neither is Frankenstein, but it's still iconic. But we talked about that during the Thing Without a Name video. So, movies didn't... I'm okay with separating movies out from literature. Radio and literature might be some cross-pollination, but I already talked about radio. And radio is kind of short. Because there's not... I mean, it was going on since 1934. It's a good chunk of the 1930s. A lot of more people owned radios than they did, otherwise. They didn't own televisions in the 1930s. But most of the things were, literature, and the big chunk of it was literature, and a big chunk of it was movies. And a big chunk of the literature and movies was horror. Well, there's a reason for that, and Stephen King... Is it in here, or was it in another one? It might be in one of the interview books. No, I think it was in here. Stephen King explains it pretty well, why it was so big in the 1930s. And of course, that was because of the Depression. During the Depression, people were ready to be scared. There's actually charts and things of economic, downturns and horror movies going. When an economy turns downward, and we go into depression or recession or something like that, horror movies jump up. 1930s, 1970s, 1980s, are big. Any of the big horror times will be economic downturn times, or any of the economic downturn times are good horror times, which is weird. Maybe there should be a economics of horror, part F of the class. I don't have the brain power for that one, unfortunately, guys. If someone else wants to teach it, I'll take the class, for sure. So for horror movies, I have a few references that I want to point out. The first, IMDb.com, best horror of the 1930s. IMDb, Internet Movie Database. They have lots of lists, user-generated lists. And these are very helpful for me, because I go through, hey, the best movies of the 80s, or the best movies of the 70s, or the best movies of the 60s, for horror. Best horror movies of the 50s, 60s, 70s, etc. And there's a couple for 30s, and that's what helped me out with this, because this is one of the days I'm working without a net. And I did see all these. Of course, I knew most of the big ones. Frankenstein, Dracula, The Mummy, Dr. Jekyll, Mr. Hyde, King Kong, Freaks. But there's a lot more, and there's a lot of people who pop up over and over and over again. Directors, actors, books whose authors are based on Poe. There's a lot of Poe books coming out in movie form. The Raven, The Black Cat, Murders of the Rue Morgue. And then, of course, the classic stories by their authors. The other one is www.angelfire.com/darkside/realmofhorror/history2.htm. This one's been really helpful for me. The 2 one, History 2, History 1 would be the silent movies, which are going to be next video, next time period backward. Next video will be 30s literature. And that will be, I'll sort of go over that at the same time I'm going over Lovecraft, because that's going to be the 20s-ish. He started it in 24, he finished it in 27. I hope that's right. I did have the information at some point in time. But I'll correct myself later if I'm incorrect there. But this site actually did have quite a bit of good references for movies. So let's jump into it. The first one I want to mention, I just want to go over it briefly. I have mentioned it before. This is Dr. Jekyll and Mr. Hyde with Frederick March by Ruben Mamoulian. This is the French video, but it's the French poster, but it's the best poster I found. I want to go over this one first because it doesn't really have a lot of... It doesn't have any actors or directors that will be popping up over and over and over again. It's a standalone. And it's the only horror movie to win an Oscar. Up to that type, and into the future for quite a ways. And on those ones, if you're, of course, if you're going by Noel Carroll's view, where you have to have a monster, you don't have anymore. You have Anthony Hopkins in Silence of the Lambs. This is how bad my brain is fried. I almost said Sleepless in Seattle there. Anthony Hopkins as Hannibal Lecter in Sleepless in Seattle. Alright, folks. My apologies for what my brain said. No, Silence of the Lambs with Anthony Hopkins. Or Misery with Kathy Bates. I think there is a discussion in here someplace about Misery. I don't remember where exactly. But Annie has Kathy Bates' character, has a preternatural knowledge of what's going on in the cabin where they live. So if it's unnatural, it can be a horror. It could be a monster, so therefore it can be horror. But it's just that she knows what's going on in an unnatural way. And does that count enough to be a monster? That's always the question with Carroll. And if you're following Carroll that strictly and adhering to that strictly, you have to answer those kind of questions. Since I'm not, and I don't recommend you do, you don't have to answer those questions. You just say, yeah, it's a horror movie. It may or may not be supernatural, but it's still a horror movie. So is Silence of the Lambs. Hot water. That's helping my voice, too. So, Dr. Jekyll and Mr. Hyde. Frederick March won Best Actor in a movie, first Best Actor in a horror movie, and last for a long, long time till the late 80s if you're lucky, early 90s if you're maybe, or not at all ever if you like. Oh yes, I have this. I actually did a chart, a graph of, okay, if we're talking about this movie, you have to mention this guy and this guy and this guy. And it's gonna get nuts. And it's gonna get nuts. This is just the next picture in the list, so let's start with that one. Todd Browning was the director of Dracula. You'll notice Carl Laemmle at the top, in the middle rather, above Dracula. Carl Laemmle presents. You'll see him on so many of these. Is he on this one too? No, it's a Paramount movie. Basically, all the Universals are going to have Carl Laemmle someplace on them. I guess he must have been big shot at Universal's, but I'm not. I can't go. I have to cut somebody out, so I'm going to cut out producers. Since since I have to cut out somebody. I'll do directors for somewhat. I'll do actors somewhat, and actresses. Fay Wray is going to pop up again and again and again. But for Dracula, Bela Lugosi, the big star playing Count Dracula. Todd Browning was the director. Todd Browning, Bela Lugosi, we'll see lots and lots and lots of in this. Todd Browning, we'll see a few times. Was he in anything weird, though? No, I think we're good. Oh, that's the one I was after. Okay. Yeah, let's go through Todd Browning first. Let's see. He remade. He rejoined. He joined again with Bela Lugosi for Mark of the Vampire, where Bela Lugosi also plays a count, but not Count Dracula, and the count is sort of almost a vampire. Almost. Things are not as they seem, one of those. And of course it's Todd Browning. Nope, not that one. What was it? I lost it already. Off. What was the other Todd Browning? Devil Doll. Devil Doll was another Todd Browning from the 30s. I should give years. Devil Doll was 1936. Dracula was 1931. Mark of the Vampire was 1935. Devil Doll was based on Abraham Merritt, A. Merritt, Burn Witch Burn. It's the someone said it was the grandpappy of all killer doll stories. Sort of voodoo doll, killer dolls, and then of course that later became, in the 80s and 90s that became Puppet Master, Chucky, Child's Play rather, Chucky, etc. But way back then it was Todd Browning. Todd Browning's other one you'll probably know most about is Freaks. Freaks was interesting. Also one that Stephen King talks about quite extensively in here. When he's talking about what it takes to be a monster, he mentions Freaks. Not just the movie, but the actual people. Do we consider them freaks? How far? He was trying to find out how far you can go to get a monster. Stephen King, he doesn't really come to firm conclusions, but he asks good questions, which is also a good thing to know and do. So, Stephen King mentions Freaks, the movie. He says it's one of those things that everybody talks about, but not a lot of people have seen. I haven't seen it myself, actually. This was one that was banned in Britain until 80-something, 82? Maybe later. Yeah, so Freaks was done in 1932, and it was banned till 82, if I'm even close on that one. Which is 50 years. Approximately 50 years. Maybe more, maybe less. Stephen King seems to think, and he's probably right, that Freaks was so controversial because Todd Browning didn't use actors and makeup. He used actual freaks from the circus or from various places. The guy without limbs is actually a guy without limbs. You know, the guy with deformities were guys with deformities. There was no special effects makeup in this movie. Well, not much. At the end, of course, there was. I'm not spoiling anything. So Todd Browning is popping up over and over and over again. Sometimes with Bela Lugosi, sometimes not. Sometimes in Universal, sometimes in Metro-Goldwyn MGM, Metro-Goldwyn-Mayer. That one, Universal. The classic monsters are called Universal monsters, but there's some studio jumping here. Of course, this was a Paramount. Dracula, Frankenstein, Invisible Man, The Mummy. These were the Universals. But King Kong was RKO? RKO. Yeah. Should I go on to King Kong next? No, let's go on to Frankenstein. Let's keep in some semblance of order here. Frankenstein was Boris Karloff, of course. And it was James Whale as the director. Oh, and you'll see Carl Laemmle Jr. as well at the bottom underneath James Whale, underneath the lady's draped figure. Elizabeth, but whatever. James Whale, Karloff, you'll see over and over and over and over again. Gosh, Karloff did so many movies during this period. It's every other movie seemed to have Karloff in it. Sometimes as the bad guy, sometimes as the good guy, sometimes as the monster, sometimes as the hero, sometimes as the poor schmuck who got caught up in the bad stuff. James Whale. James Whale's an interesting figure in and of himself. He did Frankenstein and he did Bride of Frankenstein. Frankenstein was 1931. Bride was 1935. Where's my James Whale column? Here's my James Whale column. He did in between those two, he did The Invisible Man in 1933 with Claude Rains. And Claude Rains pops up less often, but occasionally. What was the other one Claude Rains was in? I can find out while I'm talking about James Whale. Yeah, so, and he also did, not that one, he did the one I don't have a picture for, didn't he? Of course he did. He did. Dang it. Oh well. He did Old Dark House, which is what is Old Dark House? Old Dark House is James Whale Karloff, 1932. Oh, what was I was also checking on. Claude Rains. Claude Rains was also in nothing. He was in one of these. I don't remember which. So we're gonna skip it. He's not as prolific in horror field as other things. I'm sure he's been in lots of good movies. Most of these people have been. Actually, James Whale directed the Paul Robeson Showboat, and as I mentioned in my Curriculum Vitae video, I didn't watch a lot of horror movies growing up. I didn't watch any horror movies growing up. My parents didn't have horror movies in the house. They did have lots of musicals in the house, so I watched a lot of musicals, which is why I'm a horror person now. But I watched. There's no denying that James Whale's Showboat is fantastic. It's the Paul Robeson Showboat. I've probably watched it about 60 times, and it's about a 3-hour movie. It's a good one. So James Whale actually split off and did a lot of other stuff as well. Before I stop with James Whale, I'll mention a biopic about him. It's kind of weird. So weird and like emotionally uncomfortable that I stopped watching it a quarter of the way through. It's called Gods and Monsters. Ian McKellen, Brendan Fraser, and Lynn Redgrave. Ian McKellen plays a retired James Whale who was living out his last years, or his living out his retirement in Southern California. Brendan Fraser plays his pseudo love interest, sort of. It got weird. Yeah, because early on in the movie, you find out that James Whale, yes, was very interested in young men. Not underage, but, people in their 20s and 30s, when he was quite old, and retired, gray-haired. And Brendan Fraser sort of becomes his model for painting. And he's like, oh, why don't you take off your clothes? And I'm like, okay, I'm going to turn off the video now. Because it's weird for me. Sorry. Anyway, but if you guys are interested in biopics, this was a Academy Award winner for Best Screenplay Adaptation. You may want to check it out. I think I bought it for $1 on VHS. When no one was when VHSs were really cheap, which they still are, I'm sure. So James Whale, I think we can put James Whale to rest now. Invisible Man is also James Whale. All right, let's go King Kong. King Kong, Fay Wray, of course, playing the female lead. King Kong does not have any official directors, which is weird. Obviously, in this poster you won't see anything, and on the IMDb you won't see anything either. There are 2 uncredited directors that are on IMDb. One is Marion C. Cooper, which I didn't have on my list. There we go. And the other is, what's his first name? Ernest Schoedsack, or Schoedsack. Marion C. Cooper goes on to direct She, which is an H. Rider Haggard. We talked about H. Rider Haggard previously, and we'll talk about him before. He's the one that wrote that odd little book when I talked about in the Fantastic, the one about the guy who was either a religious zealot who killed his family and his girlfriend, or his doppelganger did, depending on, and then it's a Fantastic, so you're hesitating between which explanation you have. Ernst Schoedsack directed what? He directed Oh, another um, another Fay Wray, The Most Dangerous Game, which is a really bad picture, unfortunately. And Fay Wray was, of course, in this one as well. So King Kong and the... Do I have the Vampire Bat? And another one was... Fay Wray was also in the Vampire Bat. King Kong, you don't really need me to explain to you. It's been redone so many times. It's about a director who goes to an island looking to make a movie about a legend, finds the legend is real, King Kong, brings him to New York, climbs up the tower with Fay Wray, fights off biplanes, dies fighting off biplanes. Everybody feels bad for the monkey. Right. Fay Wray, anything else? No, I think that's it for Fay Wray. Marion C. Cooper, I did. Yeah, She. Oh, She. The main character of She, and the main character of Randolph Scott, by the way. He'll pop up once or twice, and of course he's not necessarily in horror, but he's in lots of things, lots of actiony things. So this is probably more on the actiony side, and they'll be that way. The first talkies, there's a lot of good actiony movies. The main character of this one and the sequel, or was this the sequel, was the main character from League of Extraordinary Gentlemen. If I'm remembering the Wikipedia thing right. I'm starting to do research on all these from this book, and of course H. Rider Haggard is in there. And I'm very interested in reading him. I haven't read any of his stuff yet, and the more I'm hearing about them, I'm thinking I gotta read more of some of his stuff. So I probably will. Let's see, where am I at? See, even today, imagine how frazzled I was yesterday, seeing how frazzled I am today. This is about the time last time I gave up. I was like, I'm too frazzled, I'll give up. But we're not gonna give up today. We're going to chug on through. Freaks I talked about. Bride of Frankenstein I talked about. Oh yes, The Mummy. The Mummy should be next. This is Karl Freund. Boris Karloff, of course, plays the Mummy. Carl Laemmle's going to be in there too. The producer, the Universal producer. The director, Karl Freund, will pop up a few times. Oh yes. Any others? Doesn't look like there's any others. The other one of note seemed kind of odd. Mad Love, Peter Lorre. Peter Lorre is going to pop up a few times as well. It's good. It's one of those things, folks. Everybody's going to pop up over and over again. Everybody was making horror movies because it was the Depression, and people wanted to go to horror movies because that's what people do in the Depression. I think I said, hey, King talks about this, but I didn't give you the quote. I don't think I did, because I had a picture of it, and I didn't put it up. No. King had a reason for why everybody wanted horror and went to the movies in the 30s, and for the Depression, is because the other option, I'm paraphrasing heavily, was to watch Busby Berkeley girls sing We're in the Money. Busby Berkeley was a choreographer and film director and producer and stuff. He did all of these things. I'm sure if you've seen videos of the women with their synchronized swimming or synchronized dancing, doing these sort of things for fun shots with the music going in the background. And the song "We're in the Money" really didn't hit people positively when they were all broke. They'd much rather go see Boris Karloff stamping through a graveyard. I'm slaughtering that quote by King, but that's generally the gist of it. Or Karloff as the mummy. Yeah, so Karl Freund did Mad Love, and I have with Peter Lorre, and I had the explanation of Mad Love because this one looked cool too. An insane surgeon's obsession with an actress leads him to replace her wounded pianist's hands with the hands of a knife murderer, which still has an urge to throw knives. That's pretty cool. Mad Love. Peter Lorre was also in Fritz Lang's M. Fritz Lang also did The Testament of Dr. Mabuse. And as you can see, it jumps around. You could do, everything snakes in and out of each other. So I'm going to try to go through what I haven't gone through. I've already been talking for 42 minutes. Bela Lugosi did White Zombie. Do I have a director for him? Nope. Not one that's going to pop up over and over again. White Zombie is probably most famous for giving the name to Rob Zombie's band, White Zombie. But it's also a movie from 1932 with Bela Lugosi. Not necessarily a zombie movie as such. It's sort of a hypnotism zombie movie. She was not alive, not dead, just a white zombie. The early zombie movies, pre-Night of the Living Dead, there's a lot of the mind control, voodoo-y aspects. That's basically what it was. It was witchcraft to take over someone. Man, I have so many on here. Dracula's Daughter, 1936. Vampire, which was a German, 1932. The Spanish version of Dracula also came out in 1931 along with this one. Different cast, different director. I don't have a video for that one. Oh, I do want to mention this one. Bela Lugosi in Phantom Ship. This was the first horror movie done by Hammer Studios. And it was year 1935. It's not a true horror. It's everybody's on a boat, and a serial killer starts picking people off in the middle of a dangerous thunderstorm. Let's see. Oh, Son of Frankenstein. Basil Rathbone plays the doctor. Boris Karloff plays the monster. Bela Lugosi plays the Igor type character. It's not a James Whale. James Whale gave up after the first two. but this is another. This is one of those where all three of them are together. Basil Rathbone, most famous for his Sherlock Holmes. Hound of the Baskervilles, of course, we've been over that with talking about the uncanny, fantastic uncanny, where the fantastic hesitation is there for a minute and then stops because it's naturalistically explained. Because Sherlock Holmes proves that no, it's not a werewolf, it's just a conspiracy with wild dogs. You'll see on here, John Carradine's going to pop up a lot more. I hope you realize by now that these names pop up over and over and over again. Boris Karloff in The Raven with Bela Lugosi. It's a Poe book, or it's based on Poe stuff. Black Cat. Boris Karloff, Bela Lugosi. Edgar Allan Poe's The Black Cat. There's The Murders of the Rue in the Rue Morgue, which I lost the picture of, which is also Poe, and it's also Bela Lugosi. What else do I have? Son of Frankenstein, Black Cat, Devil Doll I talked about. I love she. Oh, Hunchback of Notre Dame. Not necessarily a horror movie, but also came out during that time. RKO, but you know, makeup is going through a revolution at this point. So, you know, the stuff that was done in the 30s made it possible for the 40s going on to all the Mummy sequels, and of course, The Wolfman. The Mystery of Edwin Drood. It's the most horror. Well, it's based on a Dickens book. Dickens' last book, which was happening around the time Jack the Ripper was happening, so sort of influenced by that. Who was it? There's a book, Drood, that's actually being made into a movie by what's his name, and the book's by what's his name. You see my brain. My brain's been fried. Guillermo del Toro is making the movie. The Terror. He wrote The Terror. Who wrote The Terror? He wrote stuff with things. Nope. Wrong. Novels. Dan Simmons. Oh, thank you. Dan Simmons wrote Drood. Man, so much stuff. Which is basically cancel. The basis of that book is Charles Dickens actually Jack the Ripper? Getting too into researching a story. The Monkey's Paw. W. Jacobs, also during that time, we talked about Monkey's Paw quite a bit with King. Was it King? Yeah, it was King. That Tail Hook? One of the times I did talk about Monkey's Paw. Of course, that was turned into a movie at this time, so they were just pounding out. Everybody was scrambling to get out talking pictures of horror movies. Horror's selling. It's the Depression. Let's get as many horror movies as we can. And sequels. So we started the sequels with, Bride of Frankenstein in 35? Yep. That's the first sequel, horror sequel we have thus far. Maybe there's some earlier. Maybe Silent Pictures Silent Pictures sequels. Werewolf of London. Carl Laemmle again. I didn't have any real notes on this one, but one of the first ones, the makeup's not as good as the Lon Chaney Jr. Frankenstein. I think I have so many pictures here, and they're all blurring together in my brain. Yeah. So next time, History of Horror, we're going to talk about the 30s, and we're going to talk about the literature side of things. We're not quite here yet. I don't want to jump too much into this. This gets difficult. As I mentioned, the same time period, this whole page, this whole page, and this whole page is one era. That's what, the weird tradition and modern masters, and some of those are overlapping. So those are the last three chapters of his book, and the history part of his book. And he doesn't mention himself in there, and he doesn't mention Robert E. Howard. Most famous for Conan the Barbarian. If you guys are, you might thinking, I know the name Robert E. Howard. Why do I know the name Robert E. Howard? He's the creator of Conan the Barbarian, and Kull the Conqueror, and Solomon Kane. And he did a lot of horror stories, which were very good. Actually, Stephen King is quite a fan of those. The Pigeons from Hell, that's mentioned as one of Stephen King's favorites from Robert E. Howard. And I quite liked a few of those too. I liked his werewolf stories. His werewolf stories were great. Racist, but lived in the 1920s in Texas, so you gotta take the good with the bad on that one. Howard Phillips Lovecraft, of course, was quite racist as well. So I'll be talking about Lovecraft, Howard, Clark Ashton Smith, some of the other ones that were in the 30s. And then we'll go into the weird tradition, like 1927, where what this book is talking about. And, just that general era back to 1900. That'll be the 20s to zeros, 10s, and 20s. The aughts, 10s, and 20s. Together, and then I'll clump that with movies during the time, the silent movie era, horror, and the beginning of cinema. Because after that, you have literature only. You don't have radio anymore. You don't have mass media? Is that what it'd be called? You don't have TV, you don't have radio, you don't have movies before 1880 something. I'll get my exact dates right later. So I'm hoping to do 20s and 10s and zeros together with silent movies, or the rest of the history of cinema together. Basically finished radio today. We finished the talkies for horror movies. I'm not sure if there is any pre-horror movies in talking pictures from the 20s. I'm going to do some more research on that. I think after tomorrow's video, I'm going to go back and redo some more of the old ones that need to redo the sound. Because some of these I haven't done with this thing yet. So they're in the really crappy laptop mic, which didn't help anybody. Right. This is a weird video. I apologize for it being weird. And it was a 55-minute weird video. I apologize about that as well. Tomorrow will be weird too. We'll be talking about literature during this time. But it should be fun. I did watch a good documentary on Lovecraft's life on YouTube. I recommend it. It actually had Neil Gaiman, Peter Straub, Ramsey Campbell, quite a few others talk about give their ideas and opinions. And historian S.T. Joshi, or Joshi, sorry if I'm mispronouncing his name, was quite a big biographer. He's a biographer of quite a few of the people in this era. Lovecraft, definitely. Dunsany, which we'll talk about as well. And we'll get into that stuff tomorrow, though. History of horror for tomorrow. We're going to be talking about literature. Once again, I'll mention angelfire.com/darkside/realm of horror /history 2. And I'll be using history 1 as a backbone for when I talk about the silent movies. So for now, I'm Drew. I'm signing off. See you next time on Horror Analysis. Have a great night, folks.